By 11 a.m. on day one of the nationwide invasion, as the Battle of Irving was now entering a critical phase, as there had been three major thrusts to assault this sizable pocket created by the five different participating battalions. The same three armored battalions from the 35th Armored Brigade that had, with two air assault battalions, earlier captured the DFW International Airport, now having had comprised the north, the east, and the western cordons of the pocket, along with two mechanized infantry battalions from the 16th Infantry Division that had earlier cleared the entire city of Grand Prairie and taken the horribly battle-damaged Taylor Army heliport, were also conducting the southern end of the cordon of this large pocket in the city of Irving, trapping roughly 1,800 armed reactionary American civilians, as well as also an additional 200 in a separate pocket that had been created by three companies from one of the two mechanized infantry battalions holding the outer cordon. As the first initial thrust had begun as early as 8:30 by two companies, one armored infantry company completely on foot, leaving their vehicles behind with the drivers, gunners, and other essential personnel, while the squads proceeded on foot to provide mutual support to the tank company also committed from the Eastern Cordon Battalion striking westward, was accompanied by two additional thrusts made by the Northern Cordon Armored Battalion, striking in from the north, covering an area that was 2 miles wide by 1 mile in depth, with three companies, two tank and one armored infantry, that had effectively moved in to clear this area of the Alpha and Charlie companies, as well as a sizable number of 450 armed reactionary civilians, as well as also the thrust that had occurred in the south, carried out by one of the two mechanized infantry battalions, committing five of its companies to battle, along with support from their fire support company, both from their own battalion and from the other mechanized infantry battalion holding the southwestern end of the cordon of the pocket to support this major thrust into the American forces. These three different thrusts served a strategic objective of clearing the vast majority of enemy combatants out of this pocket, while also proceeding towards isolating the KLX aircraft plant that had been hit by several tactical ballistic missile strikes, namely DF-2As fired from the PLA Strategic Missile Forces Brigades in Mexico, the 612th and 613th from the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, which had called up reserve battalions to augment their active duty forces to be able to fire more missiles at a more rapid pace. Some of these missiles fired by the reserve forces included older models that had been stowed away in storage specifically for use by their battalions, while the newest, latest, and greatest systems of the PLA Strategic Missile Forces were utilized by the active duty forces. And the DF-2As, being fired roughly toward the end of their range, were able to hit the KLX aircraft manufacturing plant, along with two container-based cruise missile systems firing the supersonic, as these were not subsonic or hypersonic, but they were supersonic as in they broke the sound barrier, YJ-18C Chinese-made cruise missiles, as well as the Russian caliber Club K cruise missile systems, as 8 missiles from two container-based systems, as each carried 4 missiles apiece, struck the plant as well, in addition to the enormity of the PLA artillery barrage that had smashed the city of Irving to the ground, among other areas of the Metroplex, as the rubbled ruins became almost a Battle of Berlin type situation, as each and every single solitary rubble pile and crumbling building facade was fought over by the PLA forces pushing their way into this particular pocket or this area of operations, as they moved in with great force. By 11 a.m., both the thrust into the northern and southern portions of the pocket had effectively concluded, as These specific battle spaces that were fully cleared, and some of which even became complete total kill zones for artillery and airstrikes, had been completely cleared, and as the ISR systems had effectively scanned the 2-mile area in between the northern and southern thrusts into the pocket, the middle of the pocket was now, for all intents and purposes, effectively empty of enemy combatants, which allowed for the armored forces, after taking a 1-hour logistical resupply operation pause, to proceed south towards the Trinity River as one of the mechanized infantry companies of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion from the 16th ID, holding the general southeast of the pocket, would proceed and meet them along a key bridge over the Trinity River in this area. As the same 3 companies, 2 tank and 1 armored infantry, had proceeded south, the tank companies would stretch out along the Highway 630 route with their weapons staggered to completely hold the middle of this pocket, separating it, splitting it in two, while the armored infantry would divert and head toward the KLX plant along the Trinity River. As this would occur, the forces completing their thrust into a 1.5-mile depth into the pocket, pertaining of the armored infantry company on foot and the tank company from the Eastern Cordon Battalion, would effectively stop and hold their positions in the area, and would even be able to utilize tank gun support if needed for the forces that were about to fight at the KLX plant, which would consist of a single armored infantry company from the northern grouping of assault companies that had stormed the pocket from the north, from the Northern Cordon Armored Battalion. As at this particular time, the airport, the Love Field Airport to be exact, had already since been taken, as it was abandoned by the same armored battalion that had effectively destroyed the 2nd of the 198th in the downtown and Deep Ellum area of Dallas, along with the corresponding air assault operation by 1 air assault battalion to capture and hold the downtown of Dallas intact, as this was a major objective for post-war colonization efforts, as this was to be a fortified colonial red zone, which would take the first Chinese colonists to begin the economic exploitation of the nation. As trouble effectively would erupt just outside the Love Field, as a grouping totaling just over 650 armed reactionary civilians would materialize and attempt to challenge the armored battalion holding this area. The armored battalion, with full combat drone and also loitering munition support, would, along with their vehicles, smash this particular uprising of materializing armed reactionary civilians attempting to effectively attack the PLA forces at the airport, who also had their full ATGM support from their anti-tank company of their AFT-10 vehicles at the airport, as the combat engineers of the 40th Combat Engineer Brigade of the 59th Group Army were also clearing new arising threats of armed reactionary civilians on the periphery of the battle space. The fighting that was occurring in the heart of the Metroplex in the Irving Pocket would effectively be the last real major combat operation within the Metroplex urban area itself, as the following day would effectively see the last major combat of all in the Metroplex unfolding in the national grasslands, as thousands upon thousands of not just armed reactionary civilians, but also non-combatants who had fled to this wilderness area on the outer boundaries of the battle space would be hunted down savagely by PLA air assault forces, as this would unfold later on day 2. For the time being, as the fighting was about to conclude in the Irving Pocket, as 2 groupings of smaller elements of armed reactionary civilians, numbering roughly 200 each, were now completely cut off from one another, as well as also still being surrounded by the additional companies holding the outer cordon. These forces would be mopped up a bit later, And this would be a very simple operation compared to the earlier fighting, which will have seen the clearance of the vast majority of the combatants in the pocket, including the 3rd of the 144th, as now the climactic battle was set to occur within the KLX aircraft plant. If one were to look at a map of the area, this sat in one of the several major industrial areas within this particular portion of the Metroplex in Irving, and the KLX plant effectively sat in a horseshoe-like area in terms of the roadworks around the facility, as well as there being major rail infrastructure and other industrial sites earlier having been pounded by the artillery, and in the case of the KLX plant, tactical, ballistic, and cruise missile strikes, which struck these buildings, and one tactical ballistic missile landing right outside of one of the plant buildings and making a massive crater with its 3,300 pounds of HE warhead. And as the artillery had also effectively razed this area to the ground, many of the American vehicles from Delta Company, as well as even some from the HHC and Foxtrot that had made it to this facility, were completely and totally shredded to smoking hulks of metal if they were armored vehicles, and if they were soft-skinned vehicles like LMTV trucks or HETs, which were heavy equipment transporter trucks, or the fuel trucks or Humvees, were completely and totally removed and in multiple scattered pieces throughout the battle space, as the artillery barrage had been savage and heavy. As the battle was set to begin, as the armored infantry company from the 3 companies that attacked from the Northern Cordon Battalion had diverted itself towards the KLX plant, while the other 2 tank companies spread out and met up with the lead mechanized infantry company from the assaulting mechanized infantry company from the south. Earlier in the battle, they had linked up in this area, the tanks and the mechanized infantry, with the armored infantry headed towards the KLX plant, which was located roughly here. The thrust into the east, or from the eastern end of the pocket towards the west, will have headed 1.5 miles deep and 1 mile in depth north to south, and will again put these forces right on the outer edges of the industrial site where the KLX plant sat. Again, they could offer tank gun support from certain elevation where these tanks sat upon, as this area had very diverse topography, to say the least, as Irving was in a hilly area, as was Las Colinas, and Dallas itself almost built in a type of valley sort of terrain. As the area was a very hilly area, nonetheless, the KLX plant even sat on somewhat higher ground, although the sloping in this area was more gradual, and by the Trinity River itself, there was effectively no major steep elevation, at least in this part of the riverbed. And as these forces, with the real-time AI battlefield data processing system once again working its calculations, had deemed certain parts of the river fordable by the vehicles, as again, the Trinity River was effectively not a very deep river in most areas, although in some cases it could be as deep as 24 feet, while in many other cases there were parts of the river that were only 2 feet deep, or 2 to 4 feet. And in these areas, there were shallows that could be navigated by the vehicles fording the river. And this would be done by 2 of the 3 combat platoons of this armored infantry company, leaving behind their headquarters platoon in a former parking area of a former warehouse building. As to cross to the south would put these forces on either side of the former KLX plant, which sat effectively in a 1 by 1 kilometer area, as this was a 1 by 1 mile area. These forces would be supported heavily by air power from one of the 3 H-6K heavy strategic bombers, carpet munitioning a sizable grouping of armed reactionary citizens, as well as also the edges of the plant, which would wipe out some well-entrenched troops taking positions in the rubble, as well as others here. Artillery would also be called in from the artillery forces within the 35th Armored Brigade itself, supporting their armored infantry troops advancing against the KLX plant, firing very potent 155 millimeter artillery strikes into the rubble and its surroundings. Even the mechanized infantry in the south, using one of the two fire support companies within one of the two battalions, as each battalion of mechanized infantry had one fire support company with their platoon of PLL-05 heavy dual-purpose assault guns / mortars, 120 millimeter, as well as also their 130 millimeter Type 63 light artillery MLR systems would also rain down heavy destruction, and again, even tank gun support would be utilized from the forces that had pushed west from the east of the perimeter, namely the one tank company, along with the armored infantry support, the tanks able to fire their 125 millimeter main guns at targets in support of this operation, along with the AFT 10 company within this same armored battalion supporting the advance of their armored infantry troops as well. As there were even 3 of these anti-tank companies all together between the 3 armored battalions, although only one would be utilized supporting this operation, as the other 2 would be on standby to support any potential flare-ups of enemy combatants elsewhere, as the ISR systems of the PLA forces scoured the entire metroplex, which included the flanks of this operation, as well as also continually having assets firing into these 2 edges of the pocket, the far west and the northeast, as there were still nearly 200 enemy combatants in each of these areas between the armed reactionary civilian elements, as the fighting now for the KLX plant had begun in earnest. An H-6K, heavy strategic bomber aircraft, would drop many thousands of pounds of munitions on targets below them, effectively dropping a total of 16,000 pounds, as these could carry a total of 34,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions, which would completely annihilate these armed reactionary civilian forces, which numbered roughly 90 in this area alone beneath the aircraft, as well as a dozen of the defending American troops holed out in the rubble of the former KLX plant. They had survived as the initial artillery barrage had gotten underway by hiding out in maintenance tunnels beneath this massive factory compound before emerging to hold up positions in the rubble after the 5-hour-long barrage had ceased, as the middle company, or the middle platoon of the company, rather, of the armored infantry effectively pulled up alongside the bank of the river, the north bank, and deployed 2 squads from their armor personnel carriers on each end of their platoon, as their Type 89As effectively were the APCs with their heavy machine gun turrets aboard, holding the potent W85 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns. They also had their platoons single IFV, their ZBDL-4A, which was again a weapon system bristling with different options in terms of their firepower available, such as a 100 millimeter main gun, 30 millimeter autocannon, 2 HJ-09 ATGMs, and even a 7.62 by 54 millimeter coaxial weapon, as all of this firepower now being deployed against these forces, consisting of the vehicle-based fires, the dismounts, available firepower, everything from, of course, their small arms, including even their QBJ-201 light machine guns, which had a very high rate of fire, as well as also their HJ-08 man-portable ATGMs, and, of course, their rocket-propelled grenades, were all available for use against the holdouts in the KLX plant, as, again, ATGM support from their AFT-10 systems would be utilized to the extreme, along with also loitering munitions having had been earlier fired from the Northern Armored Battalion on the Cordon, with their headquarters and support company of their battalion with their combat drone section, which could fire 48 of these at a time, having earlier had fired these, with some still airborne as this battle begun, as 15 of these loitering munitions would be operating in this area and smashing into targets with HE warheads, as now there were effectively no vehicle targets left in the pocket whatsoever at all, as everything, as the Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie companies that were available in terms of vehicles, and even a very small number of civilian vehicles, had all been smashed in the earlier ensuing combat operations in the north and south, especially, but also the remains of the Delta Company's lost platoon, as in the two surviving company-sized elements, as half the platoon had been wiped out in the artillery barrage, while another half had made it underground and emerged as a mixed force of different squads, would effectively have already been destroyed in the fighting that had unfolded in that side of the pocket. Again, a 1.5 mile by 1 mile area, as in 1.5 mile east-west by 1 mile north-south, had been already cleared by 11:30 by these two companies, the tank and foot-based armored infantry troops that had left behind their combat vehicles to continue holding the cordon. As they had cleared this area, again, it put them very close to the KLX facility on the slight southeast of where this industrial area was located, as they were effectively roughly a mile away. And although the tank guns could fire well beyond a mile, this put the 125 millimeter main tank guns able to cover everything in this area and even beyond if need be, as from where their current positioning was in that side of the pocket. As the vast majority of armed reactionary civilians had been wiped out, a small number that had made it into this area was being pounded from the air, not only by an H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft, but also from one of the JH-7s out of the JH-7 squad of 12 aircraft of this type, as they had dropped 4,000 pounds of munitions on this area, which wiped out some armed reactionary civilians taking cover in rubbled ruins of a former industrial building, as well as others that were out in the open trying to run towards the KLX facility, as another 8,000 pounds was about to be dropped on this grouping, making a mad dash towards this facility as they were fleeing from the armored infantry and tank companies, as in one company each, that had assaulted the area again slightly to the southeast of this facility. And now, having made it into this industrial site, which is one of the last major areas of the pocket that was about to be cleared, would be destroyed from the air by, again, a very powerful JH-7 strike from the air, as now the mortars and even rockets from the mechanized infantry battalion immediately south, the battalion that had conducted the strike into the pocket, was now firing in support of the armored infantry operation to capture this area as well, as the air power had effectively smashed large numbers of armed reactionary civilians in this area, completely annihilating them, and even groupings of defending troops, as a dozen were wiped out. And even though they were entrenched well in the rubble of these former massive industrial buildings, the heavy pounding of munitions in this area wiped them all out, even on the edges, and some here as well, as the rest had fled to better positions in other parts of the building. The fording of the river had begun, as the draft of these vehicles was such that the engine and turrets were well above the water, as this was only 2 feet deep, and they could ford the river as they lined up one at a time, with the IFV leading the column of the platoon as they crossed the shallows on the other side of the river, including in this area, as the nearest river crossing bridges were both about half a kilometer to the east, including a rail bridge, as well as also another half kilometer to the west of this particular battle map, as the firefight was very heavy with these American troops and PLA troops and their vehicles firing back and forth across the river at one another, including using a tripod-mounted 50 cal, which effectively wasn't powerful enough to do anything to the PLA APCs, especially from the front. The troops, even though they were in the prone position and taking the best positions they could in the prone behind earthen areas, some would be severely wounded, causing the combat medics to hurriedly race to these forces and pull them out, as they would be wounded in this firefight, although there would effectively be no KIAs in this operation among the PLA forces, simply due to the sheer ferocity of their firepower advantages being pressed to the extreme, as these American troops in two squads, as all of these American forces in the KLX plant and in these two industrial buildings, as this was effectively a large concrete slab and ramp where supplies have been offloaded for these plants in recent times, including here as well. These troops, moving out of their cover in the rubble, would be heavily hit by the 130 millimeter light artillery rockets, as well as also 155 millimeter repeated shellings into these areas, including this grouping of armed reactionary civilians having taken cover in this rubble, and emerging to engage the PLA vehicles as they crossed one by one, following one another across in a single column on each side of the KLX plant to outflank the plant, as the heavy air raid into this area and airstrikes over here as well had effectively wiped out the vast majority of the armed reactionary civilian threat already, and even some of the troops, again, entrenched in the rubble. As again, this was a crater from a previous DF2A strike, which struck just outside of this building, while others got direct hits on buildings, as there were 3 DF2As used, and again, 8 total cruise missile strikes, which hit these buildings directly from the container-based systems, 1 Russian Club K caliber-based system, which was 4 missiles apiece, and 1 Chinese YJ-18C missile-based system that struck these buildings with 2 cruise missiles each, while again 3 DF2As, 2 with direct hits on the buildings and 1 just outside of this building. Again, they were, for a tactical ballistic missile system, fairly well accurate in terms of their CEP, as a CEP of 100 or less was considered very accurate for a tactical ballistic missile system, which meant that within a 100 millimeter circle, that missile was guaranteed to hit, which means that the radius was effectively 50 meters on either side, which made this very accurate. And if it was a 100 meter circle for even more accurate systems of a CEP of 50 meters or less, the circle, of course, is much smaller at a 50 meter diameter circle, which meant 25 millimeter radius. Again, these were very accurate tactical ballistic missiles, even though these were older, and they were still very destructive with their 3,300 pounds of HE warheads. And this was a massively destructive system, which brought these buildings to the ground in conjunction with all the howitzer and rocket strikes from the very powerful artillery systems of the Northern Firing Grouping of Firing Battalions from the 19th Artillery Brigade, namely its PHL-03 300mm multiple launch rocket system, its PLL-01 155mm system, and PLL-66 152mm systems, which these were, of course, 2 towed howitzer types, and the vehicle-based or self-propelled 300mm multiple launch rocket systems, which had smashed Irving, as well as areas around the DFW International Airport and areas all around Dallas to the ground. So the southern grouping of artillery forces mostly handled southern areas in the map. And again, there were other artillery battalions spread out among the maneuver forces that could handle their local areas, including the artillery battalion of the 35th Armored that was now partaking in this operation against the KLX plant. And as these forces were now crossing the river in force with 2 platoons, the middle platoon was continuing to lay down heavy fire support as loitering munitions had entered the battlefield looking for targets of opportunity with their AI target-seeking mode, as again they would come crashing down on their enemies, completely destroying them, as American vehicles already littered the battlefield as they had earlier been destroyed in the massed artillery bombardments. The only remaining vehicles were shredded up hulks, twisted metal, effectively, with multiple holes or effectively ripped to pieces of the former armor personnel carriers and even Bradleys of the Delta Company, the Foxtrot Company, which was the forward support company, which also had some M113s for forward support vehicles to effectively run ammunition and supplies to forward combat units. And also even the mortar track had been destroyed by the PLA forces in the massed artillery bombardment. And now these forces were effectively flanking the facility to prepare to assault it, and they would have precision artillery support throughout this process of seizing this facility, as these forces would fight on for as long as they conceivably could against the heavy supporting fire being laid down by this middle platoon as the other platoons crossed in a line. These armed reactionary civilians, having already been slaughtered by two heavy machine gun turrets aboard two Type 89As while they exchanged brief fire with them at the opening of the battle, these forces, now having had crossed into the area, would have some wounded that would also cause combat medics to enter the fray and have to pull them out as well, as there was an armored ambulance that could ford the river to pick these forces up, although this was conducted on foot, as immediately across the street where the headquarters platoon forces, where their casualty collection point and also PLW collection point was, as that was the nucleus of the operation being carried out by these forces, including their company captain and overall command of this particular tactical aspect of the operation itself. As these two squads, again, these were mixed units between three different surviving assets of these three companies of the battalion of the 3rd of the 144th that had been completely smashed in the artillery barrage, as again, had been relatively few survivors among these three companies, as their bivouac sites were more out in the open compared to the three combat companies, Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, who had been bivouacked in very well protected, steel-reinforced concrete parking garages that were multi-tiered or multi-floored. This had saved their troops and their vehicles from absolute total annihilation at the opening barrage. But these forces had hid underground and had emerged to find a complete moonscape of cratered, rubbled ruination all about the battlefield, including the armed reactionary civilians that had survived, as there had been many tens of thousands of non-combatant KIAs in the opening artillery barrage, in the 5-hour-long barrage. And now that they were emerging, they would be struck by a host of systems, which included the long-range ATGMs, the HJ-10s, which had a total 6.2-mile range, which was very impressive for an anti-tank guided missile, all of it ISR and AI guided. It's the real-time AI battlefield data processing system put together the strike packages, in addition to tank gun support from 125mm main tank guns aboard the Type 96B main battle tanks, as well as also the support received from the 155mm self-propelled PL-Z05 howitzers of the 35th Armored Brigade's Artillery Battalion, as well as also, again, even support coming from the Mechanized Infantry Battalion's Fire Support Company within it, as one of the two Mechanized Infantry Battalions would directly support this operation with their 130mm rockets and 120mm mortars from the PL-05 dual-purpose weapons, as they could be used as a direct fire weapon, an assault gun, or canted and fired as a mortar. In this case, they would be a heavy mortar weapon in this battle. And as also the massed bombardment from the H-6K had occurred and effectively wiped out a large number of armed reactionary civilians, along with some of the military personnel defending what remained of the plant in its complete total rubbled state, as well as also, again, very powerful JH-7 strikes on armed reactionary civilians as well, as a large number of them at the opening of this map, as it opens, were already now immediately hit by thousands of pounds of air-to-ground munitions, as another 8,000 pounds were being dropped on this grouping here. Scattered about were the remains of earlier destroyed armored personnel carriers, Bradleys, and other vehicles that were armored that had effectively been pummeled by the artillery barrage, including a mortar track. And all of these vehicles littered this battlefield. And as these forces were now pulled into their areas where they would deploy their ground troops from their vehicles, these troops began to race towards the tracks to take a position along the rail berm to fight against these forces, and these forces exchanged heavy fire once they had come and emerged out of their vehicles, including 35mm tube-fired grenades, light machine gun fire, rifle fire, rocket-propelled grenade fire, and even an HJ-08 being fired into this grouping here from over here, and more, as there were also loitering munition strikes and rocket strikes coming in now, with artillery strikes called in through the quadcopter assets, circling the battlefield and acquiring the targeting data for precision strikes, as well as mapping the battlefield in real time, showing where all active enemy forces were, as well as removing them once they had been destroyed or KIA'd. As also the same occurred with their own forces, if forces were effectively wiped out, they too would be removed, but no vehicles would be lost in this battle. As the lead IFV had pulled into position, followed by the armor personnel carriers, the troops had been deployed in 3 squads facing the KLX plant and would storm the plant from the east, while the other platoon simultaneously pulled in. As there were no threats effectively now to their west, they would still deploy 2 squads to watch their western flank, while having all the vehicle-based weapons now facing this area, using these 2 squads to watch their flanks. While these troops would be deployed with heavy fire support from their own vehicles, loitering munition strikes, artillery strikes that would come in, precision strikes. The forces now holding the plant were being viciously attacked from 3 sides, and again, the forces that were headed towards this plant now had to fight their way through these forces, which would never happen, as the heavy mortar strikes came in against these forces, including these 2 American mixed squads from these 3 companies of their battalion, HHC, Foxtrot, and Delta, that were effectively, for all intents and purposes, wiped out, except for the scattered survivors that had made it to this plant area. They now were in a life or death struggle against these forces, but with the direct fire being vectored at them from the dismounts, the vehicles, and artillery, mortars, rocket strikes from the light artillery rockets, loitering munitions, and AFT-10, HJ-10 strikes, these forces effectively stood no chance and had been wiped out with a relatively high degree of rapidity. As these forces had emerged, it wasn't but approximately 10 to 15 minutes as these forces had emerged to fight this column that they had been destroyed by all of this intensive firepower, including from the dismounted squads and their vehicles. As the forces in this area in the south had been all but wiped out by the JH-7 strike, there were no more threats from this area, and now these 3 squads could assault the buildings of this facility as heavy artillery support came in, as these troops now fled the area after many of their troops holding the perimeter of this building had effectively been wiped out by the vehicles and the squads and some of the loitering munition strikes with HE warheads. This grouping had fled deeper into the rubble to try to hold out, but an artillery strike would come in and effectively finish them off. As this grouping here of a half squad and another half squad had retreated into this building and around this rubbled, ruined building and this part of this horribly destroyed building, they would be wiped out by heavy machine gun fire and dismount fire, as this squad would then seize this position after the L vector of heavy machine gun fire and dismounted fire in a wedge formation so they could fire in different directions had finished wiping these forces out with the platoon across the river who had consistently been laying down heavy fire support for this operation to allow for this assault to take place. Concurrently across the factory, or the ruins of it, these 3 squads of this platoon were now bounding and covering tactically toward the building as this squad and this squad, and this squad had emerged from their vehicles. This squad bounded first, then this squad into the building as they held positions on the edges of the rubble, and this squad as well, bounding into this area, fighting off the rest of these troops in close quarters, heavy, small arms combat. Again, there would be a few PLA wounded, but not severely among this squad, while these squads would take no wounded and would completely wipe out the remains of these forces as they had tactical L-vectored fire guided by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, interlocking fields of fire, L-vectored fire, just wiped these personnel out with the loitering munition strikes, HJ-10 strikes, and artillery strikes as these forces fled. Again, this grouping would flee, hit by artillery, leading to this squad taking this building, while this squad took this building and advancing to this position, while they would advance out into the main courtyard after this movement had occurred and the artillery strike had finished off this half squad. These artillery strikes came in and finished off this fleeing group that had earlier fled from the pounding coming in from the H-6K heavy strategic bomber, laying waste to this huge area before the platoon had advanced across the river, even smashing enemy forces of the defending forces hiding in the rubble, allowing for these forces to hurriedly flee to engage these forces who now advanced into the factory complex, and they would hold their positions in these buildings from these 3 squads after eliminating the remains of the defenders none of which were willing to be taken alive, including the lieutenant colonel in command over the entire battalion of the 3rd of the 144th, who was wanted either dead or alive. Of course, preferably alive, as higher-ranking American officers still had immense intelligence value, as he was hiding in the underground maintenance tunnels beneath the factory compound with a small handful of troops. These squads would effectively patrol these tunnels and then wipe out the lieutenant colonel and his entourage as they would try to put up a fight in the tunnels, but would be completely annihilated by the immensity of the PLA small arms fire, as effectively the lieutenant colonel, although he had an M4 carbine and a 9mm pistol, this was not enough against these PLA troops who came down with 35mm tube-fired grenades, QBJ-201 light machine guns with an exceedingly high rate of fire, firing the dangerously potent 5.8 by 42mm round, which actually was a very highly capable rifle cartridge round, bullet even, as the muzzle velocity, the size of the round, and more were effectively very capable in terms of armor-piercing capabilities, as also these forces would deploy hand grenades in the tunnel system as well against these small groupings of holdouts, namely the small entourage and lieutenant colonel that were hiding in the maintenance tunnels. As this battle had come to an end nearly as soon as it begun, this was a relatively short-lived battle within this 1 by 1 mile area, as the very potent amount of firepower from the air, as well as the loitering munitions, and also the light artillery rockets, heavy mortars, 120mm, and the immensity of the repeated shelling into these areas, including into the factory, as precision strikes were called in by the artillery forces through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, putting together the strike packages for them, coming directly from the ISR data gathered by the quadcopter assets as the exact positions were shelled of American troops. All of this firepower was far too much, as even there was some tank shelling from the 125mm main guns of some of the Type 96B main battle tanks that now sat in the eastern end of the pocket as they had struck into it from towards the west from the east. And, of course, they covered virtually this whole area with 125mm fire, as they had utilized heat shells against some of the more sturdy factory buildings in a few instances, as the heat shells had better penetration capabilities than the frag T-shells for this type of construction in terms of the rubble pile that was formerly these factory buildings. And, of course, the HJ-10 ATGM strikes were also highly accurate and ISR directed through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. And again, in conjunction with the Mechanized Infantry Fire Support Company firing in support of this armored infantry operation as well. So again, this was an immense amount of firepower, all the way down to the lowly dismounted troops, who had access to their own man-portable anti-tank guided missiles, the HJ-08s. Of course, they had rocket-propelled grenades, like so, from their Type 69s, as well as also 35mm grenade fire, hand grenades, and light machine guns and rifle fire as well. As all of this was a very powerful array of firepower when combining everything together. These forces were simply unstoppable, especially with the advent of the very powerful AI data processing system in the military domain that directed all of the combat and even advised the commanders while making the firepower highly efficient and well economized, and also very safe in terms of avoiding friendly fire incidences, as the calculations from the AI were precise. Everything, even terrain maps and even water flow and depth of water, were calculations made by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system with the vehicle specifications, allowing for them to ford certain areas of the river. All of these things were processed by the AI in split seconds, and the answers were effectively rendered in seconds. as the calculations occurred in split seconds, as everything was updated by the second, including enemy positions. The AI system was a masterstroke in terms of military capability. And now that the KLX plant had effectively been cleared by the PLA forces deployed from the 2 attacking platoons, sending in a total of 6 squads of their 10 available squads, these forces now had total control of the KLX plant, even beneath it, as they had scoured the tunnels looking for the lieutenant colonel in his hiding place and his small entourage, who were somewhat spread out in the tunnels, but they were all annihilated as well, as they refused to surrender as the squads moved tactically through the tunnels. And now that the KLX plant had effectively been taken and cleared and the area around it was deemed secure, the remains of the pocket, which was the Irving pocket, now having been assaulted on 3 sides and largely cleared, now only left very small groupings of armed reactionary civilians to be dealt with, who were already in the process of being wiped out by another 2 companies of AFT-10s, one from each other armored battalion, each company from each other armored battalion, the Western Pocket, or western side of the Pocket Armored Battalion and the eastern side of the Pocket Armored Battalion that were holding those cordons. Their respective AFT-10 companies were already pounding the positions of armed reactionary civilians in these 2 sides of the pocket, including also fire from tank guns into these areas that were directed through the ISR network and real-time AI battlefield data processing system, as well as also, of course, continual artillery fire from different batteries within the 2 different artillery battalions of both the 16th Infantry Division and the 35th Armored Brigade, who were partaking in this operation, as the 35th committed 3 armored battalions and the 16th committed 2 mechanized infantry battalions to the overall operation, and their firepower contributions were decisive. Of course, there were other aircraft operating from the JH-7 Squadron, as well as also the J-10 Fighter Squadron and J-11 Fighter Squadron, as they had earlier returned, armed with air-to-ground precision munitions, who would also partake in these strikes. And also there were 2 additional H-6Ks that had not been utilized yet, with their very powerful payloads of 34,000 pounds apiece, as well as also even the 2 stealth heavy strategic bomber aircraft, again, one fully combat loaded and another that still had 2/3 of its entire payload on board for air raids. And they could be used in a tactical way now, as most of the strategic targets, if not all, were now completely pounded into the dust. As all of this was unfolding and effectively ended by 2 p.m. in the afternoon. By this point in time, all of the combat that had been occurring along the major invasion route, at least in central Texas, where the external invasion forces were now rapidly advancing through the area by the afternoon, were passing an already taken city of Austin, as the savagely brutal People's Armed Police, who were deployed in this area, as they had 1 brigade here, as well as also the Russians, who had a division in this area, had rapidly taken control of the city of Austin. Although there would be small residual flare-ups in the area, they were effectively in total control of the entire city, as the People's Armed Police and Russian army had fought a brutally savage campaign to capture Austin, and had done so with great efficiency, and in the case of the People's Armed Police, with brutal fanaticism. As in the Fort Hood area, as some units had tried to escape the installation, as I-35 effectively ran parallel to the installation some distance away, as it ran through the city of Temple, which was immediately to the east of the installation. As some American vehicles approached the interstate, they had already been knocked out by loitering munition strikes, artillery strikes, and other weapon systems that had been deployed against them by the Trojan shock units in the area, as they were not permitted to escape alive. And as the external invasion components in their many miles-long columns were proceeding up I-35. They had passed the wreckage of these forces on the way, as Fort Hood had effectively been a very savage battle, as the PLA, including special forces, as seen rappelling into some of the key buildings as this Russian T-80U main battle tank is rolling by one of the main thoroughfares in the installation, had fought a very hard battle to capture the installation, as at the time as it was captured, there was a sizable number of American troops in the field training with live weaponry, although the battle was mostly decisive and one-sided. The fighting would lead to a longer battle occurring as some units did escape to Waco, as the rest of the PLA's 68th Group Army would be fighting eventually a 2-hour-long battle for the capture of Waco, as some of the American units arriving, along with the National Guard troops already there, would dig in the middle of downtown and would fight a prolonged battle compared to the other battles that were effectively unfolding throughout the entirety of the South Central invasion sector. Technically, the Battle of Dallas would also be a 2-day-long battle as well, and of course, the Battle of Oklahoma City was a relatively lengthy battle also. As the Fort Hood battle was simply one of the largest in terms of actual military-on-military battles throughout this campaign, the fighting elsewhere, including Houston and also even Fort Bliss, were also relatively sizable battles in terms of actual force-on-force battles, in terms of the military forces involved, as the fighting, again, was mostly one-sided, as once a force had lost all of its ISR capabilities and communications capabilities, as well as being attacked by a much larger, more concentrated force with heavier firepower, the proverbial die had already been cast, as the saying could be said, as there was effectively no way by which the undergunned and technologically depleted force, and even ammunition depleted force in many cases, could have a chance at winning. As it pertained to the armed reactionary civilian elements involved in all of this combat, they too were woefully unprepared, as they were poorly organized in most cases, although there were some civilian militia groups, but they were few and far between. The forces, for the most part, of armed reactionary civilians that tried to react immediately and fight back had no centralized leadership. They had no logistical capability whatsoever at all, which was a major drawback for them. Their communications and organization and coordination was also exceedingly poor and woefully non-existent initially. And all of this culminated to result in the absolute and total devastation upon these types of elements, as the more wise among the armed civilian population had long since fled into the wilderness at the opening of hostilities, where they would begin to set up bases of operations as they fled far outside of the primary invasion zones, which were where the key nodes are being fought over and the fate of the nation was effectively being decided, as everything that comprises a nation is effectively its main transit corridors, its major and medium-sized cities, and also its major industrial hubs, as if all these things are removed, a nation effectively ceases to exist, as whoever is in control of these controls the nation. Although the tertiary areas would still be cleared at a later time. In the tertiary areas, which were massive areas of the country, the armed civilians had breathing space and at least some time to effectively get themselves together to prepare for the inevitable, as they would have to begin to delegate responsibilities amid their people and assign tasks to people who were adept in those tasks. Leaders had to be picked among the most capable delegators who were effective organizers that could get groups into functional units, effectively, as the delegation of responsibilities is what made a good leader a good leader, as a good leader could find people with talent in specific areas and thus assign them specific tasks and effectively allow their subordinate leaders to flourish in these opportunities and effectively bring the unit together as a fully functional fighting force, as well as also a survival force, because now that these massive groupings of armed civilians that had fled into the wilderness, again, far beyond the initial invasion sites, these forces now would have a real chance at beginning to organize and beginning to figure out how they would obtain their logistics required for long-term sustainable operations. That was the problem with the reactionary armed civilians, is that they did not have any of these capabilities starting off. And that is why it's impossible to fight off a professional military force at your mailbox. It's a fantasy. It can never happen, especially a professional military force who is fully streamlined through artificial intelligence, as demonstrated throughout this entire series. A fighting force that has full command of communications and IT capabilities, ISR capabilities, gargantuan quantities of munitions, command of the air, and all the corresponding weapons platforms and ammunition, as well as command of the sea and command of the ground. As, again, all of the firepower streamlined through AI and ISR capabilities working together efficiently, highly effectively, and with a high rate of speed and a very high tempo of operations, would throw any opposing force off keel. And effectively, that's what occurred to the US military. They were not prepared whatsoever at all for this type of invasion, including the doctrine through which all of this was used, called fourth generation warfare, wherein the Trojan shock armies effectively are the heart of the operation. They are those who carry out the capture and or destruction of any and all major objectives to prepare the way for their reinforcements up the major invasion routes, again, which were the external components that came up from across the borders, or south in the case of those coming down from Canada, that would effectively roll through many major nodes along the way that had to be completely cleared and captured by the Trojan shock armies. Fort Hood was, of course, one of the largest of all priorities, simply due to the sheer size of the installation and volume of firepower it possessed and forces. A high concentration of weapon systems had to be deployed against this installation. Everything from the strategic missile forces with their massive volume of tactical, ballistic, and cruise missile systems, as well as also the sheer number of heavy artillery systems deployed against this installation, as well as also the highly advanced and capable armored forces that had been deployed against this installation, as well as the forces had, in this instance, been somewhat better prepared than in many other areas of the country, as again, about a quarter of the American units on the installation were out conducting interoperability training and other types of training, and were doing so with live ammunition. Had they not done so, they wouldn't have even gotten off a single shot against the PLA and Russian army, as, again, they would have had to go sign out ammunition and weapons, and the immense amount of time it would take for whole companies and whole battalions and whole subunits of the 3 Corps to do this would be immensely lengthy and impossible to do. And therefore, they were somewhat fortunate in that they had units that were out in the field. But again, these units had no recourse against the sheer volume of firepower that was being deployed against them. Everything on the ground and everything in the air, which included combat drones and loitering munitions, combat drones firing ATGMs, or dual-purpose anti-tank, anti-ship missiles like the CM-502KGs at targets below, simply smashing them, along with the very powerful air power, which included even heavy strategic bombers like the H-6Ks that were over Fort Hood, and of course other aircraft and more different types of weapon systems, which again included even tactical ballistic and cruise missile strikes in massive volumes. As many targeted this and other installations, including with SEAD operations. As the Irving pocket, by 3 p.m., as it would take one more hour to effectively destroy and or take prisoner the remaining 200 on either side of the pocket, by this point in time, the battlefield of the entire DFW metro area would be quiet for at least an hour, as there would be a lull in the fighting, as before this operation had ended, these armed reactionary civilians trying to counterattack the PLA Armored Battalion at Love Field will have failed miserably against these very powerful forces, as the forces on Love Field, again, had full loitering munition, combat drone, even air support from the PLAAF, and of course their own ATGM forces, and tank and APC and IFV forces, and also more. As these forces were defeated and crushed by the Armored Battalion, some of the Armored Battalion's companies, along with the PLAAF committing some aircraft, would later, in approximately a few hours, strike and destroy a materializing grouping of 500 armed reactionary civilians who would threaten a portion of I-635, which, now that the PLA effectively controlled the whole metroplex, minus the National Grasslands, which would be next on the menu the following day, these little flare-ups that would occur inside of the city as armed reactionary civilians would materialize from their underground hiding places or other hiding places and would become a minor thorn in the side for PLA forces, such as combat engineers, who would assist in mopping up these small groupings of American armed reactionary civilians on the periphery of the battle space, as well as also the Armored Battalion committing some of its forces from the 16th Infantry Division's one of two armored battalions, as this armored battalion from one of their two brigades had assaulted the 2nd of the 198th in the downtown of Dallas, along with the Air Assault Battalion having had captured the city intact. And now that they had seized Love Field, largely abandoned, and had fought off this somewhat broken up type of counterattack, if it could be called that, they would then assault this grouping that was headed toward this segment of I-635 a few hours after the fighting had fully wrapped up in the Irving pocket at 3 p.m. As again, the PLA effectively controlled the entire metro area itself, again, minus the National Grasslands, which was now flooded with refugees and armed combatants. That would be cleared the following day, as an operation was being prepared in order to do so, with the air assault forces effectively being the primary force chosen to conduct the operation. But for the meantime, residual flare-ups on day one would effectively be mopped up, including the soon-to-erupt battle along I-635, which will be covered in the next installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series, highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines utilizing a Sino-Russian coalition invasion. More to come in the next video.